Like, Coldzera played as a stand-in for compLexity from 2021 early September. It was actually technically joined on the 9th of September until almost 2 months later. Technically, he left on the 8th of November. During that time period, he played 3 tournaments and 1 qualifier. Obviously, you could say technically he played 2 qualifiers or even 3 qualifiers because the RMRs are qualified for the major and the Blast, like, fucking showdown is a qualifier for Blast fall, like, you know, finals, but I'm not counting those. I'm talking about the IM winter qualifier, which is at the end, admittedly with a different lineup. That's the one we had at Alu, for example. One was obviously the RMR, like I said, they didn't qualify. So the problem is the results during these tournaments were fucking dog shit. The only decent ones actually were at the very beginning in the Blast fall group, so they actually initially were overperforming. You know, they were in a group where people absolutely thought they had no chance to get out. They at least made it vaguely close, but they didn't get out of the group stage, hence why later, 2 tournaments later, they went to the Blast Fall Showdown. But before that, they had IAM Fall, where they didn't qualify. They finished 17th to 20th. Blast Fall Showdown comes along. They finished in 10th place. Again, didn't make it to the finals. And then even when they had the stand-in for the qualifier for IAM Winter EU, they didn't make it through that either. Terrible end to the project in general, but quite frankly, and this is the purpose of this video, I was waiting to see if they were going to keep this lineup going like 4, 5, 6 months and do a review of the whole team, because I actually think a lot of things I said would have played out like that. But just with the sample size we have now and the way the project's ended, I think it's a terrible end to the project, because the worst thing about it is, it's like an example for me of how not to recruit players and structure a team and how not to solve problems by adding in what actually causes more problems and doesn't improve your squad. Like, in my opinion, this team, this lineup, never had a chance to succeed with Coldzera. That's why I call it Coldzera's compLexity. To me, the Coldzera compLexity was even more hopeless than the other ones. Like, at least the ones, if we go back to before the whole Poizon saga, at least those lineups, like, had moments and areas and certain elements of balance between youth and experience and, like, loose style and tactics and fucking aggression and defense. Like, this lineup, this more passive lineup, I don't know, this one looked bad. Like, in my opinion, they had fundamental problems and player issues performance-wise and role-wise before they even signed Coldzera. And signing Coldzera solved pretty much none of them. Pretty much none. So think about the roster they had before they got Coldzera. Config had a broken hand, and let's be real, like, he wasn't in the lineup, and I think behind the scenes, based on what I've heard, they already knew he wasn't returning. He was going to play out his contract and he was going to Australis. Also begs the question, did BlameF know during the majority of this time period, like Config, that he was also going to Australis at the time? And was the idea, like, we play out the end here, or he had also already told Jason and compLexity, like, giving him a hint, like, I might leave in a few months, or was this the last gasp, like, bring a Coldzera, like, we'll give it a last go, boys, and if it works, maybe I can reset. I don't know, but I will say it certainly makes me wonder about the way BlameF chose to play and sacrifice, and the way his numbers went to shit. So when Config goes out the team, you're already in massive trouble, because you've just lost a player that, quite frankly, you're not going to get a better player than him just on the free market or in a lower level team. And he was a really aggressive player who was your most skilled player. So you can't afford to lose that. You're not going to replace that, most likely, unless you really break in the bank. And this was a free transfer in terms of signing Coldzera. So you've lost an aggressive, really skilled star player. Obviously, you didn't know if he'd ever fully return anyway, but you hoped he'd be part of your team. You wanted to build on him for many years. I can tell you, compLexity were not happy that Config just played out his contract and then fucked off to Australis. Rush had already been benched months prior and basically had gone from the team. He's just technically still under contract or whatever. Who's the other aggressive player and is also a very selfless player in the team. Keep a track of some of the words and labels I'm using here. They'll come back later. Now, at least he was replaced, though, by Esatag, who can be quite a selfless player himself. I would say he's more of an all-around player. I view him more on the supportive, which can obviously include entry elements, etc. On that end of the equation, I don't view him as like a star player, a top AWPer. I don't expect him to frag out in a team. I expect him, in theory, to be your worst player. And if he is, your team actually has a chance to be a pretty good tier 1 team, in my opinion. It seems like he has good comms, good mindset, can play a lot of these different roles, quite a smart player, veteran, etc., got experience. Then you obviously have BlameF, one of the big names in the team. Now, the issue here was, he was technically, during the time period before they got Coldzera, their best player, and the stats were the best. He was the best performer overall, the most consistently good performer, especially when they didn't have Config. He also, quite frankly, had been, if not the best, one of the best players in the team the whole time. My issue is, For me, Config was the true star of the team. And when Config was going ham, and maybe on some of the odd games you can throw in if Poizon was having a good game, that's what won them matches and made them go deep in tournaments. Quite frankly, BlameF was as good seemingly the whole time before the Coldzera issue. And it didn't seem to really affect whether they won or lost the game. He just kind of got his numbers. It's one of the reasons why I was really sceptical about the way he was calling and seemed to be calling around himself as this passive lurker, especially when he wasn't a guy who did a lot of backstab. And then I'll add in, it made me really wonder, like, what is the impact of his frags? Like, this seems like there's a lot of empty calories here, a lot of like exit frags, or you get a lot of kills on saves or something. Like, something's a bit off on this. Like, why aren't these kills actually like affected whether you win the game or not? Like, think about the way someone like Nico plays in G2. He puts up numbers, that's going to win you the game. So in terms of the other aspect of BlameF as well, he's the in-game leader. So at the end of the day, I have to look at the results of the team as well. I always had my questions about that, like how good an in-game leader is. As far as I can tell, when they had their good pieces in a decent role balance, they were a good, maybe bordering on very good team, and decent other than that. But they were never a great team, and they were never a really bad team. The actual floor was fairly high, but the ceiling, that was reasonably low. I don't think they ever truly got it together. So beyond Config, whoever actually looked world-class out of the players in compLexity, except BlameF, and he is the IGL, and as far as I can tell was calling for himself, Happy-esque. You know, in Happy style, like just calling around himself. And if he frags out, he gets all the numbers, but does it always impact winning the game? Then, of course, you had the other two. You had JKS and Poizon. JKS was a failed star signing from ages before. He never really fit the team. He never got close to his old numbers on 100 Thieves. Apparently, according to my interview with him, he adapted to others and maybe gave up roles or resources to allow the BlameFs, the Coldzeras of the world to fit in. The problem is, even though those numbers became stable, they were very average to, quite frankly, poor. And he didn't give him much star power. And at best, he was just sort of like an overpaid, overqualified support development that was just all right at best. But you brought him in to be a superstar, like potentially you brought in Coldzera. So you can see there was something flawed with this team. You bring in the pieces and they don't do it. In fact, if anything, they look like they play worse at times. Then you have the last player, which is Poizon. He'd already had the time off. He'd had the fucking injuries. Then there's that story that I'd already heard something about behind the scenes, that like he didn't even pay attention in fucking scrims and was just like just looking at other stuff while people were explaining stuff, which is a nightmare. Like I can't handle attitude issues like that from an inconsistent player, especially one who's had all this time off and I paid a small fortune to. His performance anyway, the whole time he was in compLexity, was all over the place. He was way too inconsistent to be a true star player and star AWPer, especially considering how expensive the AWP is and the fact that he had a really aggressive style, which was always going to get fucking figured out. Otherwise, he'd have been one of the best players in the world. I told people that when he monstered Astralis on LAN in that first tournament blast spring groups at the beginning of 2020. I said, look, if this guy can play at this and hit shots like this and performance, he's just going to be one of the best players and best AWPers in the entire world. So I go ahead and say it won't happen and he will get figured out and he won't have these sorts of games. He won't hit his shots and he'll die as a result of it, and people figure out how to publish him. So I think people did. I think they did figure out kind of how to play against him, and he wasn't that consistent anyway, and his whole other external shit meant he took care of himself, didn't he? So what you have to ask yourself with the group of players they've had here is, what was that team lacking at the end before they got Coldzera? They probably needed a better in-game leader. That's one area you could have upgraded. Look on the market, who is there? Maybe you could say you could have had MSL or something like that. Aside from that, yeah, you know what? Some of the other big names are elsewhere, aren't they? Maybe you want a better entry player. Like I said, not many aggressive players, not many players with skill on the aggressive side of the equation. So you don't have config turning. Could have done with a nice entry, right? What about a player like a Bobski? Maybe someone like Fur. Would they be on the market? Sonny, would these sorts of players be available? Could we consider them as stars and playing a bit more aggressive? Didn't get those, of course. Then maybe you want some more fragging. I think you certainly want more fragging in this team since the roles are so fucked. So since you've lost config, I gotta say, you're gonna have a hard time ever replacing him in terms of fragging power and raw, like literally just raw fragging power. Not the stats and the plus minus. I'm talking about how many frags can you get each round. I don't know how many players you're going to get who are going to do that unless you go in the CIS region, so I think they were always in a little bit of trouble there. And then I would also say the other thing they needed in line with all that is they needed some more consistent / reliable aggressive play. You have to make up for losing config, rush, Poizon. JKS and BlameF, who remained, are the super passive players. They're the players where everything revolves around them. They don't open up and create space on the map, do they? So for me, you can't just do config's out, but it's all right. Like, even though they had all standards, we're going to get Coldzera. Like, you know, they were the star players, right? You've lost an entry, an aggro player, and the most skilled player on your team. You have got to, if this happens, either totally remodel your team, bring in Coldzera, but remodel the squad completely, or you've got to find the pieces that you can replace or upgrade to make the team complete, make it actually make sense. Like, I've noticed there's a difference in trend in sports. Like, for my money, from what I've seen of the NFL, American football, it's such a complicated game. You're probably better off actually getting a player to do specifically what you need. I think that's actually the strength of what people like Belichick have done in the NFL. Meanwhile, if you go over to what's my native American sport, which is the NBA, I actually feel like the NBA is more about just sign the best players you can, and then after that we'll generally model and fit the team. Like, look, the Lakers this year are a joke of an example of how you don't do that. And some of the super teams have been bad, but that's because players made those teams. If a GM properly just took the approach, like, I'm going to get a couple of big players, and then what I'll do is whatever couple of stars I have, I'll base the team around that. I think you can do that as long as there's not too much overlap. That's the better approach there. So for me, if you want to ask where is CSGO, I would say CSGO is a bit of both. You've got to consider both elements, because you've got to have a certain level of firepower, but too much without the certain role fit, style fit, and personality fit will kill the team no matter what fragging you bring. But I would say it's more towards the former. It's more about trying to find exactly what you need to complete this team, or to bring something more of another player, or to cover a player's weakness. Maybe he's too passive, so you get an aggressive space creating player, and suddenly you don't notice that guy's passive. So you can model many, many types of teams. I've always explained that. But the problem is, it can't just lack elements. Like, I can't just have 5 passive players and then make a team. Like, maybe that could work. It'd have to be some genius tactical team, though. I can't just have 5 aggro raw fraggers that have no brain. Again, possible you could craft it as some sort of team. But the other thing is, complexity's already done being a top 10 team. They've already done being a team that makes the playoffs of big tournaments. They're trying to be a team that potentially takes some good pieces. They've got some pieces that could potentially be in a number 1 team, and they're trying to go to number 1 or go to number 5 consistently. And adding Coldzera was never going to do that. That wasn't the right piece to go ahead and get into. So let's get into all of this shit. Let's talk about this. Coldzera, yes, is a better fragger than Rush, but he ain't taking Rush's spot. That was Zesitag who was replacing Rush. Essentially, even though he hasn't been in the lineup for a while, Coldzera's replacing fucking Poizon or Config at this point in time, right? Probably, if you look at the order of things, probably should be considered Config if you look at when they're bringing him in. Now, the problem there is these are aggro players. So how's this going to work? Like, Coldzera himself isn't even the type of player, if you look at his profile currently, that you'd maybe even want in complexity unless you king different players out. Like, he's not a top fragger. Yeah, he seems like he probably has the potential to still be good, because a lot of it was mental. Or I've heard his work ethic's a bit trashed and his mentality's gone out the window. So he isn't the Coldzera from years and years ago when he was a fabulous master of the game. But he's still a decent to good player. The issue is, his role and his tendencies in the team show you it's going to be a nightmare trying to make this work. Like, we've got BlameF, JKS, and Coldzera. All really famously passive players that the whole system has to revolve around. They require resources, space, and time. Great. Then, only of those 3 is BlameF putting up any numbers, and then his impact's questionable. So, BlameF, see, I'll give him props for this. When he brought in Coldzera, it seemed like he tried to make it work. It seemed to me like he did seed some of his roles. He didn't become more of the entry type player, more of a player with the pack. As a result, by the way, BlameF tanked his own numbers. And then Coldzera didn't put up the numbers to be a star player. Quite frankly, seemed pretty off. Didn't really seem to know when to push, what to do. I actually thought that he didn't seem that comfortable, even though he had the occasional good performance like at the beginning of Blast. Aside from that, I thought it was very underwhelming. It was as bad as in FaZe for my money. Worse, if anything. And then I thought BlameF himself, when he put himself in these different positions, looked like he was a bit lost. Looked like he didn't really know what to do with himself, how to make himself have more impact. You look at he just had less frags, less impact overall. Then you've got to add in, I've heard these things about Coldzera's ego, what kind of influence he has to have over a team, the demands that he makes. So to me, you were adding a problem. You weren't removing a problem or fixing a problem, unfortunately. There's other teams you could maybe put Coldzera in and make it work. The main positive for me to sign Coldzera would be the implied effect, which is if he hadn't have just joined on this short-term contract, blah, 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 if they hadn't have put him in a team where it seems to me like how the team played would decide if he stayed and the team could never have succeeded. If that was not the case, if Coldzera was committed to the project, or at least he just wanted to like bed himself in and then you could sign other players and he would stay, then you could maybe make the argument it's a good move. Because here's the thing, he potentially can attract players, like Brazilian players, for example, that maybe can make the team better. Like, maybe he brings in Fallen as an IGL, don't know about as an AWPer. Maybe he can bring in first some sort of aggressive player. Maybe Taco wants to join as an IGL if he gets his shit together. Maybe Phelps come in as an aggressive star player. All these things. Maybe Henny can come in as the AWPer. Who knows what's possible, right? You've got another person drawing you in, where some of the other names, some of them are good players, but are they really drawing people? I don't know. I think the Colorg always suffered from being able to get their pick of the good players. They supposedly, I heard, was going to get the Astralis trio, Zonic, Dupree and Megas. Didn't happen. they were potentially going to get other players over time. I won't mention certain names, but sadly some of them turned them down. Then add in, because they've lost Poizon, they don't have a real AWPer. I'm sick and tired of seeing Essetag try to AWP. Look, he can do it as a secondary option on certain maps and certain CT spots. I don't want to watch it as a primary AWP. It's a waste of everyone's time. So you imagine some of the names out there who've been around at times. Device was in their mix at certain points in time. Imagine if he could join a team like this. Imagine if Bobski could be signed. Admittedly, he'd be a lot of money, whereas Coldzera's free, so I get it. But if we're talking just football manager style, aggressive player, young, fucking horny to play, would do what is told by his Danish in-game. Like, there's a million factors at work there. How about Roy, who just saw what a banger he is in Copenhagen Flames? Seems like he's very dependent on how they use him in his team, and he's figured out his form now. This guy could be an underrated addition to a team like this. MSL, as I referenced earlier, great in-game leader, could take pieces that he hasn't worked with yet and potentially be amazing with him. I know he doesn't have config anymore in this lineup, but some of the other pieces would be very interesting to see him work with, right? He'd have JKS, maybe he could have a Coldzera, he'd have BlameF. I'd like to see what he would do with that. So to me, the free transfer angle is one of the only aspects which at least makes sense about this. He didn't spend money on the buyout. I'm sure his salary was certainly not cheap, and I'm certain he had an impact on the team and influenced you in some way for good or for ill. But I think this has to be remembered as an example of how basically this was throwing good money after bad. And the worst thing is it killed the whole project. Like, it made you just, at the end, you were left with a team that was so expensive to fix or maintain or manage. You were getting so little in terms of results, and you didn't really have many pieces to build around. Because if BlameF wasn't going to be an IGL, you don't truly have a world-class piece at their role that's proven and with LAN experience at tier 1. So as a result, I think unfortunately this team was always going to die, or they were going to have to always move on from this core and rebuild. And I don't think adding Coldzera at the end was the move, quite frankly. Just like adding Fallen to Team Liquid, if anything, only accelerated or gradually staved off a few symptoms, right? It didn't really actually address any of your issues, and in the end you still had to address them. And what happened there? Potentially that team's going to be ripped in half and bring in new players, etc. So I think this is a good example of how not to build a team, even though I have a lot of affection generally for Jason Lake and the compLexity organisation.
Yo, this is Alup. You got pretty big balls to watch Thorin's YouTube video.
This video was kindly supported by Iskander, Lager15, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Travis Goff, Zack Schmidt, Adam Ochs, Animosity, Butt Pounder 420, Chronic Alcoholism, Hades, Jdubs, Jensen Goh, Joseph Ginsburg, Kovacevicd, Tobias Bernasconi, Zoomba, Zyrathenia, and of course, a special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion and DZL. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? You want to ask me a question? Maybe you want to know who the guests are for my upcoming content, or you'd like to take part in one of those long donated discussions. Well, put your money where your mouth is at the Patreon link in the description box below and join the Skrilluminati today.